Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about a narrative, the narrative of the Snowflake Generation, which actually has a Wikipedia page. I was surprised to learn, a term used to characterize the young adults of the 2010s as being more prone to taking offense and less resilient than previous generations, or as being too emotionally vulnerable to cope with views that challenge their own. Now, in this video, I'll explain why this characterization is not true. Sort of almost completely made up, actually, and assisting me today by providing a textbook example of this argument is Thoughty2, a YouTube talking man with 2.4 million subscribers. I'll be taking a look at his video entitled, "Why is Everyone Getting So Offended?" currently with close to 650,000 views. Now, as always, I'd encourage you to watch his video first, so you can be sure I don't misrepresent his argument, which I understand goes as follows. So Thoughty2's video starts off with him identifying the Snowflake Generation, a group of, quote, he then gives an example of a time when he says political correctness had fatal consequences by talking about the 2009 Fort Hood shooting, arguing that the attack could have been prevented, but that political correctness stopped the Butos army from taking action. He then moves on to talk censorship of comedians and comedy shows, such as Monty Python and Fawlty Towers. He then argues that comedy should have no bounds, and that criticizing offensive comedians amounts to censoring their freedom of speech. Thoughty2 then talks about how, due to the Snowflake Generation's social media use, advertisers don't want to advertise on shows that are deemed too offensive, citing YouTube as an example, and mentioning his own channel as on that's had videos demonetized for not being advertiser-friendly. He then moves on to say that being offended is natural, and people have always been offended by things, but the difference today is that the Snowflake Generation millennials are acting entitled. You see, they've apparently grown up in a time free of violent war, oppression, and poverty, and as a result, they don't know what it's like to not get everything they want. He then moves on to talk about how he's offended by instant coffee, but it would be ridiculous of him to campaign against it or try to get it banned. Then Thoughty2 spends a while talking about the recent court case in Scotland where internet personality Count Dankula, I will never get tired of saying that, was fined for making an offensive YouTube video. Then he closes out with a rousing speech about standing up for yourself against the evils of political correctness, set to footage of a man running on a beach and punching the air triumphantly. Like, what's with that? What's he doing? He just hates political correctness so much. That's Thoughty2's video. Anyway, sorry, I don't know his name, so I'm just gonna have to call him Thoughty2. So what do we think? Well, I have 2 points to make in response, essentially, and I can just tell you them both right now. So firstly, as Thoughty2 points out, people have always been offended, but his point about the millennial snowflake left being more entitled than previous generations, that doesn't hold any water, I'm afraid. The previous generations were just as prone to acting entitled as millennials, sometimes more so, I'd argue. Secondly, Thoughty2 attributing this entitled behavior to people on the quote far left is at best totally arbitrary and at worst betrays a severe BS. As we'll see, it's incredibly easy to find a counterexample on the right wing for every behavior that he attributes to the left. So, spoiler alert, that's me counterargument there. It isn't just people on the left, and it isn't just the current generation. But don't take me word for it, of course. Let's go back through Thoughty2's video now and make those same 2 counterarguments repeatedly and slower. So we all start with our minor point, admittedly here. Thoughty2 leads out by saying he doesn't usually make this kind of opinion-based video being more used to making fact-based videos like what Facebook really does with your data. The strange habits that will make you a billionaire, how one man sold the Eiffel Tower twice, the ugly truth about tipping, and so on. I trust you noticed the thumbnail theme. So why do I mention that here? Well, at the start of his video, while Thoughty2 is introducing the topic of discussion, the Snowflake generation who are dominating social media with their incessant entitlement, he shows a series of flashing images of scrolling social media feeds, which you might imagine would display the sort of thing he's talking about. But if we do a little freeze framing, we can see it's actually things like the Twitter page of a camera company, a Finnish film production company, what appears to be a search for the word awesome. You know, innocuous, random things like that. Now, the point you might make here is if these offended snowflakes are so ubiquitous on social media, why not show some of them to evidence the claim? You know, why instead use unrelated stock footage like you would in a video where you weren't making a serious political point? For instance, now I get it. He's talking about social media, so he includes some social media stock footage. It's not directly relevant to his point, but it sort of suggests itself to be relevant. It goes by too quickly for the viewer to notice. Anyway, it's just a little video editing trick. I'm not even complaining about it, really, and it's not a point worth making by itself. But stick with me, I am going somewhere with it, I promise. I want now to talk about the following two clips that Thoughty2 includes in his video. As he's describing the ultra-far-left militants, he shows this clip of some sort of rally or protest in London. So are these our offended snowflake generation? Well, let's take a look. Zooming in on this image, we can make out the flags of Unite and Unison, which are the two largest of trade unions. Now, they organize for workers' rights, among a whole bunch of other things. Unison were founded in the early 90s and mainly represent public sector workers like teachers, nurse workers, and so on. Elsewhere in this march, we see a Govai Fox mask and signs that say, "We are the 99," things associated with the Occupy movement, which was itself largely a reaction to increasing economic inequality. So what's my point here? Well, it's telling that when Thoughty2 later tries to provide his own example of something he could get offended about, he picks something totally inconsequential, that people drink instant coffee. But all of his actual examples in the video of so-called far-left millennials are actually people being offended, if you can even call them that, about things that are anything but inconsequential. You know, these people are marching for their rights as workers. They re-marching against economic inequality. Those are hardly trivial topics. So there's two video clips there that don't quite line up with what Thoughty2 is saying. So let's look at the next one. Is the third time a charm? Let's see. So as Thoughty2 is explaining how the far-left militants are, quote, hell-bent on campaigning for a cause for people they've never even met, he shows this clip of a crowd at a rally. Again, it goes by fairly quickly. About all you have time to notice is the Palestinian flag in the center, so naturally, you assume this was some sort of far-left rally in support of Palestine or such like. And that must be what Thoughty2 is criticizing. However, if we pause the video, we can see a few other interesting things in this crowd. Who am I kidding? We can see one other interesting thing in this crowd, the speaker. Now, most of you will have noticed by now. Yes, it is. That is Alex Jones. Noted far-left millennial snowflake, Alex Jones. No, of course. This is far-right conspiracy theorist in 4's 9-11 truther, Alex Jones. And I love when I find something like this. You know, when I saw it was Alex Jones speaking there, I wanted to open a bottle of champagne. So this clip is from a speech that Alex Jones gave at the 2013 Bilderberg Fringe Festival, where he denounces globalists, whatever that means. A fellow speaker was Vcodec, a British conspiracy theorist who believes that an interdimensional race of reptilian beings called the Archons have hijacked the Earth, and that a genetically modified human Archon hybrid race of shape-shifting reptilians, also known as the Babylonian Brotherhood. You get the point. So what does this mean? Well, Thoughty2's error in evidencing his claim actually disproved his claim. This isn't a far-left rally populated by people offended about something insignificant. It's actually a far-right rally populated with people offended about the reptilian takeover of our planet. So hardy har, a mistake was made. Again, not that big of a problem by itself, but it fits into a larger trend of Thoughty2 not providing evidence of this supposedly ubiquitous snowflake generation. And this is true of the first example of the negative effects of political correctness that he talks about, the Fort Hood shooting. So on November 5, 2009, a U.S. Army major named Nidal Hassan carried out a mass shooting on a military base in Texas, killing 13 people. Now, following the attack, there were investigations into how Hassan's radicalization was not acted upon earlier, and the attack prevented. For example, Hassan had exchanged emails with a known radical Islamist and was investigated by the FBI, but they concluded that there was enough information to warrant a larger investigation of him. Thoughty2 lays the blame for this failure to prevent the attack at the feet of political correctness, of course. Now, I'd be skeptical of that myself, given that the U.S. Army has in recent decades invaded and occupied Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. So not offending Muslims doesn't seem to be all that high on their list of priorities. But whatever the reason for the FBI or Department of Defense failing to prevent the attack, what, I would like to ask, does the attack have to do with the people Thoughty2 has been talking about thus far, the snowflake millennial lefty crowd? Because I don't know if Thoughty2's noticed, but those people tend not to join the military or the FBI, and they certainly don't run the military or the FB. I mean, are you telling me a bunch of army generals are like, well, we can't fire the Muslim, can we? Imagine what they all say about us on Tumblr. And Thoughty2 elsewhere says that the power of the snowflake generation lies in their ability to appeal to advertisers to not associate with people or brands that aren't politically correct. But that pressure doesn't really apply to the Department of Defense, does it? You know, hashtag boycott the U.S. Armed Forces doesn't really work. If you want to blame political correctness for this, you can't pin that blame on millennials or the left, because they are not dictating FBI or DOD policy. Now this also holds true for the arrest and trial of Count Dankula, so let's talk about that for a little while. First off, I've never liked how this was reported, this case. Everyone always puts the pug front and center, which you know, why wouldn't you? I get that. But at wager, it was more likely that Meechin was arrested because he put out a video in which he repeatedly says "See Kyle and gas the Jews" while giggling. That's the offensive part of that video. You know, not anything he taught the dog to do. Anyway, I don't personally agree with Meechin being arrested. Meechin, being I think there's enough people only saying gas the Jews completely seriously for the justice system to occupy its day. You know, arresting Meechin was a waste of time and resources, if you ask me. I also don't agree with him receiving an £800 fine, though the fact that he received £100,000 in donations afterwards means that he's probably not gonna be losing any sleep about it. Anyway, in isolation, me and Thoughty2 agree here about the Nazi pug trial, so why am I talking about it? Well, it's because the fault lays with the justice system, the police that arrested Meechin and the courts that prosecuted him. This is with they says this it says this it that's the of so and again, a little something about millennial far-left militants. They tend not to like the police very much, and they certainly don't run the court system. You know, this incident has no place in a video about the quote, Snowflake Generation, because they didn't have anything to do with it. If anything, this is an example of the opposite. Meechin, himself a millennial, was prosecuted by members of the previous generation. Censorship by governments is the problem, not censorship by young leftists. There's no examples of those people censoring anyone in the video. Let's look at this Starbucks example. So as Mr. Thoughty2 is talking about the power of the snowflake crowd, which he says is the ability to rant and rave on social media about brands not being politically correct, He shows this article from the Mail Online. Starbucks hit by a cascade of negativity after ordering staff to talk racism with customers. Vice President forced off Twitter. X. Now this article concerns Starbucks' much ridiculed Race Together campaign, where store workers were asked to discuss race relations with customers ordering coffee. Now, this is an example of a brand doing something not politically correct and offending millennial sensibilities. This is an example of a brand attempting to market itself to those sensibilities and failing because its idea was incredibly lame. You know, people on social media made fun of it because it was ridiculous. So what's Thoughty2's point here? Does he think that the Race Together campaign was a good idea and that social media users should have mocked Starbucks for it? Also, I mean, it's a Starbucks. I think they'll probably be okay. You know, they were criticized, but they weren't censored. If they self-censored in response to criticism, that's their decision. Freedom of speech goes both ways. They're free to say whatever silly thing they like, but we can't expect them to be free from being criticized for it. And also, Thoughty2 is doing the exact same thing he's complaining about here. He's criticizing millennials for criticizing Starbucks. So if he thinks Starbucks are being censored by that criticism, then I claim that the people censoring Starbucks are themselves being censored in turn by Thoughty2, who I am now censoring because I am criticizing him. One could argue, and if you criticize me for that, then you re-censoring me. It's all terrifically confusing. It's just a rather odd point to defend some megacorporation against only mockery. You know, why would Thoughty2 get offended on behalf of Starbucks? They never asked him to do that. It seems his delicate sensibilities can't handle a little light-only mockery. It's just like a millennial to take to social media to complain about comedy. It's just some jokes, Thoughty2. Comedy should have no bounds after all. Speaking of comedy, let's carry on talking about comedy. Thoughty2 says that, quote, Thoughty2 mentions Ricky Gervais here. Now, I don't remember Ofcom ever censoring Ricky Gervais. I remember him being under investigation for calling Susan Boyle a, quote, which he was cleared by Ofcom for. Now, I disagree with Ofcom there, but that doesn't really matter here, does it? The point is that Gervais was censored. The government's communication regulator cleared him. Now, because I'm a very old man, I also remember back in 2002, when the precursor to Ofcom, the Broadcasting Standards Commission, filed a complaint about Gervais for doing a routine about genitals on a lunchtime radio show on a Saturday. Which you know is fair enough, isn't it? You know, I do imagine even Mr. Comedy should have no bounds over here would agree that actually comedy should have some bounds. Like, I shouldn't to be able to go and play a Lois Cake routine to a classroom of 5-year-olds. I think we do all agree. There does need to be some standards there. Thoughty2 also mentions the Pythons, and particularly John Cleese's sitcom, Fawlty Towers, for having a section of its episode, The Germans, edited out of earlier broadcasts for containing a bunch of racial slurs. Now, whatever you think about that, the Pythons are an odd choice to mention in a section where you claim comedians are today more censored than ever. For example here, when Monty Python's movie, Life of Brian, came out in 1979, it was banned outright in several countries, including parts of the UK. John Cleese and Michael Palin engaged in a debate on the show Friday Night, Saturday Morning in 1979, where they defended the movie from charges of offensiveness and blasphemy. So how old exactly is the Snowflake Generation? You know, were they around getting movies banned in the 70s? Is this guy part of the Snowflake Generation? This is why Thoughty2's point about millennial entitlement doesn't make any sense. There's absolutely nothing new about this entitled behavior. Lots of people felt entitled to Tree to get the movie banned, and they did. And it's another example of Thoughty2 artificially aiming his criticisms at just one political wing at the expense of the other. He also mentions YouTube demonetization, citing himself as an example. But one particularly hard-hit section of YouTube is people who make content for an adult audience. Videos about trans issues, for instance, are notorious for being demonetized quickly. And they are hardly something you'd expect the ultra-millennial left to be protesting, are they? A similar point can be made about stand-up comedians. Now, when noted left-leaning British comedian Stuart Lee wrote a musical called Jerry Springer the Opera, offended religious groups took to the streets to protest it. And when they broadcast the show, received 55,000 complaints, Pebble threatened with prosecution, and Lee and then the were that the way they were the should you well with them so again, acting entitled and trying to get offensive things banned is not a behavior exclusive to the young, nor is it a behavior exclusive to the left. If you've noticed, I'm basically just making the same 2 points over and over again here. You're gonna have to deal with it, I'm afraid. I do have a question to ask, following on from that last point. When you hear someone refer to people who are supposedly too easily offended, why don't we think of people like this? Or like this? Or like this? Why don't we mean people who call the police on a black person for having a barbecue? Or sitting in a coffee shop? Or selling water? Or mowing a lawn? Why don't we mean gamers who blow their tops about seeing a woman or a gay character in a video game trailer? You know, why do we give bigotry a pass in the narrative of the easily offended? We say, that's just a racist. That's just someone who hates all the people. That's just a misogynist. That's just a religious fundamentalist. But the millennial snowflake left. They re-offended for no reason whatsoever. And I don't like this for a few reasons. Firstly, it implies that there's some rational, unemotional basis for bigotry. And second of all, it implies that the left have nothing rational to say, being driven purely by random emotional outbursts. Which is, of course, the reason why this narrative exists. To push that idea as far and wide as possible, utilizing hapless chaps like Thoughty2 here. But when you look at what the supposed Snowflake Generation are actually talking about, it's workers' rights. It's a minority representation, economic equality, and so on. There's nothing in this video on the level of triviality as being offended by instant coffee. Thoughty2 closes out his video with speculation as to why the current generation are apparently so offended and entitled. And he says it's because they've never known what it's like to not have everything. They've never known war, or oppression, or poverty. They re-spoiled, basically. Now I imagine there's plenty of young soldiers in the military who disagree readily with this YouTube chap, telling them that they've never known war, given, all of recent history. But even besides them, this idea that the current generation has everything too easy is just complete rubbish. Compared to their parents, millennials have lower average wages. They work longer hours. They have less stable jobs. They in more debt. They pay more in rent. They pay more for houses. They less likely to be promoted. They entered the workforce around the time of the worst economic downturn in a century. If they re-angry, if they re-emotional, they got reasons for that. Even the person that was unflatteringly screen capped for the thumbnail of this video in order to represent the typical offended millennial, well, I went and found where that's from. And they re-arguing at a rally with a Trump supporter who's just called immigrants rapists. Now that's a political argument. It's a valid reason to be offended and to get angry. Just like your rights as a worker being threatened, or your reproductive rights being threatened, or your rights as an elite person being threatened, or the reptilian Illuminati who control the banking system. If you dismiss political activism as belonging solely to the easily offended and overly emotional, you've been sold a false narrative designed to neutralize you by someone, probably an older and richer person than you, who'd prefer it if you just kept quiet and did what you were told. So that's about it from me today, folks. Am I really gonna close out with a call back to the lizard men thing? Yes, I am gonna do that. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you didn't, that's because you're re-offended by what I have to say, and maybe you should work on being a little more rational. Thanks as always to all me supporters over on Patreon who pay for these videos, even though they re-free. No one tell them that though, please. I'm kind of dependent on the income at this point. If you'd like to join them, please feel free. The feeling of triumph after signing up is akin to running along a beach and punching the air in joy, if that goes any way to persuading you. I also have a Twitter and a curious cat if you fancy sending me a question. Also, yes, I know this video isn't the video I said I was gonna make next, but I changed my mind because I saw Alex Jones in the clip earlier and I was like, oh, I have to make that video. The other video is on the way though. I promise. I am sorry. I am sorry. I'm such a failure.